Welcome to the Digital Analytics Power Hour. Tim, Michael, and the occasional guest discussing digital analytics issues of the day. Find them on Facebook at facebook.com/analytics hour. And now, the Digital Analytics Power Hour.
Hi everyone, welcome to the Digital Analytics Power Hour. This is episode 46. You know, when we started this podcasting journey more than a year and a half ago, one of the things we attempted to do was develop a measurement strategy and key performance indicators, or KPIs, am I right, for the show. And just to review, our goals were to publish 26 episodes, get at least 300 downloads per show, and have a growing trend of listeners, and do a podcast about making the podcasts. Well, we hit all but the last one, and we aim to rectify that right here and now. This might initially strike you as a bit indulgent and definitely meta, but if you're nerds like us, I think you're going to enjoy it too. Tim, senior partner at Analytics Demystified, and my co-host. Hello, sir.
WCBE and WOSU would be my public radio stations that I listen to. Thank you very much.
That doesn't make sense in context at this
juncture. It doesn't matter, but I know what we're talking about, so I'm making a joke. Anybody who's read the title.
We keep telling people on this podcast that context matters. Anyways, it doesn't matter. I'm Michael Helbling. I'm the analytics practice lead at Search Discovery. So, naturally, we wanted to draw on the experience of someone in the big leagues of podcasting. And so I am excited to introduce our guest, Steve Mulder. Steve is the Senior Director of Audience Insights at NPR. Prior to that, he was the VP of Experience Strategy at Isobar, and a long time ago, managed the user experience at Lycos, a little search engine probably you might have heard of. He also has written a book about user experience called The User is Always Right, a practical guide to creating and using personas for the web. But we are delighted to have him on the show to talk about podcasts. Welcome, Steve.
Hey, thank you very much. Great to be here.
I think you have a perfect NPR voice, so this seems like it's working really well.
You are very, very kind. I think I'm surrounded by people that I work with who would never say such a thing.
Okay, well, I also have no idea. So, but anyway, welcome to the podcast. We're excited we're here. I think as we kick things off, we want to talk about both podcast measurement as a practice, but also kind of how NPR is doing it. And maybe a great way for us to start is just for folks to understand sort of what it is you do at NPR and kind of how that intersects with all of the different podcasts and audio and measurement that NPR is doing.
Yes. So our team, the Audience Insights team, is really the hub of audience intelligence within NPR and across the entire public radio system of NPR stations. So we do, we run basically digital analytics, broadcast analytics, custom research, third-party research. We're really, trying to bring an understanding of audience and how to act on that understanding across the entire organization, right? Whether it's programming decisions, digital decisions, business decisions, you name it, across the board. And of course, part of that umbrella is podcasting, the wonderful world of podcast measurement.
Is that entire team based in Boston where you are, or is it scattered across different offices?
Yeah, it's scattered across the galaxy. No, it's primarily in DC with a few folks in Boston as well.
Ah, okay. So is the podcast ramp up from NPR? So I think I make no secret of the fact that I listen to multiple NPR podcasts, and it was excited when like Fresh Air kind of became a podcast because it seemed like it was a laggard for a while. I think that's WHYY out of Philadelphia. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Yeah, we'll edit out all the fanboy stuff. Maybe not.
Oh no, we'll keep it in there.
Keep it in there.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm sure we will get to analytics. There is, to me, it seems like NPR is such a natural because you guys already do audio content and kind of journalism-based audio content. And so podcasts seem like kind of a natural shift, but like, how much can you talk about the evolution over the last 3 or 4 years of somewhere a light bulb going on, and kind of where did measurement fit? Because it seems like when you're running through affiliate stations, basically, and everybody is a member, hopefully is a member, and there are funds being raised and you have that local tie. And I would think that measuring media as radio is kind of radically different from measuring audio media as the on-demand radio of podcasts. There's like either 6 questions or no questions in that.
Yeah, the weird thing about what we're doing right now is measurement across all these platforms that NPR takes advantage of is so different. Traditional broadcast radio comes with long time existing standards, first through Arbitron, now through Nielsen. That's kind of an established science, right? Like measuring traditional radio. But then you get into other forms of listening, whether it's a live audio stream, which pretty much all the NPR stations have now, or on-demand audio such as podcasts. It's all vastly different, which is what really complicates our life every single day. You're totally right.
So let me ask, is the traditional long-standing, I've always had a theory about TV, measuring TV audiences, that it's actually fundamentally crap, but it's just long-standing, totally accepted crap, and is live broadcast radio everybody accepts it and just kind of takes the numbers at face value and doesn't question the validity? It seems like it would be very similar challenges as measuring TV effectively.
Yeah, it's it depends who you talk to, how much credibility there is in those numbers, but it speaks to something that I really believe in, which is that whenever we talk about a standard in measurement of anything, we're talking about a standard is it's a good enough, mutually agreed upon thing we're all going to point at and say, yeah, that's a good yardstick, that's good enough, let's just use that. So, while any kind of measurement is never going to be perfect, as we all know, we live and breathe this stuff, you got to start somewhere. So you start with TV, you start with radio, and there's a lot of technologies in radio that are getting better and better at measuring broadcast signals, but they're not perfect. But it's something the entire industry has pointed to and said, you know what, that thing that Nielsen is doing, and they're coming out with ratings every month, every year, that's good enough. Let's just move on with our lives and rely on that as a standard. And that's what we need in every listening platform, in every text platform. We have it on the web. We need it in the world of podcasts. That's something that's been evolving. I know we're going to talk about, but that's absolutely true in the broadcast radio world as well. It's just Nielsen's decided this is the way to measure it, and we're all sort of on board with that and rely on it as pretty good. They've gotten really good at a lot of things. It's going to be perfect? Nope, never going to be perfect.
So it's like bond rating agencies, right? I mean, those are totally reliable and never. No, sorry,
it never possibly goes. Nothing ever goes wrong.
I had not even. It had not occurred to me the live streaming, which occasionally I'll like dip into when I'm like surprised. I'm like, oh, hell, Sonos. Look, I can click on, radio by TuneIn, or I'm not sure which one I click on. I'm like just to check and say, oh, son of a gun, I can listen to my local. So do you have a sense, do you guys have, when you talk about audience, that you've got X% of your audience is only traditional broadcast radio, which I do that because it's my wake up in the morning on the radio, and then X% is live streaming and X% is more on demand, and these are the ones who are across all channels? Is that some of the stuff that you try to wrap your heads around?
Yes, we constantly try to wrap our heads around that, and we do with mixed success. The hardest thing about my job right now, one of the hardest things, is getting that true sense of audience. Because while I have these amazing data silos, it turns out to be really hard to measure someone like you who might be on the radio and on podcasts. And to me, in my systems, you look like two different people, right? You're a podcast listener over here, you're a broadcast listener over here, and I can't necessarily combine that and see you as one person. So I end up with exaggerated audience reach numbers in a way that I can't dedupe right now in a really easy way. And there are folks working on this, but it's absolutely a key problem for a lot of organizations, media organizations like us, that are struggling with how do we get a much truer sense of audience reach when we got all these platforms out there.
For somebody who claims to be such a huge fan, Tim, it's pretty bogus of you to do that. So
I'm telling Steve right now. So just write it down. I'm giving you the what unique keys do you need?
Just know that 30% or so of the traffic you're getting from Northern Columbus, probably Tim Wilson.
I'll write that down. I'll put that into my analytics tools, and that's perfect.
Well, I mean, the crazy thing is it runs into the same thing. It's more challenging than web. My daughter, my youngest, that's kind of a common thing she wants to do is when I pick her up from gymnastics, she's like, can we listen to a podcast? And I'd say half of the time it's an NPR podcast. And you're back to the same audience issue of now you've got a household listening to it. Now she's probably a couple of years away from being a donor, but she's the future. I don't know where that was going.
No, but this is one of the key ways where, we think about podcast measurement as an evolving thing, like all measurement is, right? But it's kind of a couple steps behind where we are with web measurement when you think about it. So I like to think about this sort of as an evolution, right? So you've got on the web, we began with hit counters. Oh, we remember them fondly, the hit counters of our youth. So you start with hit counters, you start talking about hits. Then we started talking about page views. Finally, we started talking about audience, the people who matter, talking about people. Who would have thought, right? And you get this evolution of what you can measure, this evolution of what's important to measure, how we're going to use that information. Similarly, in the world of podcasts, where you've got, initially it was all we had was that file was requested, that particular episode. Well, we don't know what happened after that. Then you got to talking about downloads. How many downloads did a podcast get? And now finally we're getting around to talking about what's important, which is audience, talking about the people that are downloading these things or listening to them via streaming or whatever. And we can start treating that data in a much more evolved way than just talking about hits and page views and downloads in a very raw sense. So that the way we think about it, I think, even in the last 3 years has really evolved that way.
So not to take us too far off course, but there's sort of a subject that I wonder if you could shed some light on, which is just sort of what have you observed in sort of the growth of podcasting generally? Just, you speak from the perspective of NPR naturally, but, I don't know how long podcasts have been around. They've been around a long time, but they've grown in popularity over the last, say, 5-7 years maybe. And I don't know, have you seen anything in that growth, or what have you observed?
Yeah, I think there's a few things going on. One is you've got an entire society that we are now drawn to self-curated ways of consuming media, right? I mean, think about our consumption of video and TV and movies. It's become much more prolific across all types of channels and platforms, but it's also much more about selection, right? Like choosing what we want. And similarly now in audio, in spoken word, you're seeing that same evolution where people are realizing there is so much amazing content out there, this podcast included, of course. There's so much amazing content out there that I have so much at my fingertips. We have merely to expose people to all that rich offerings and let them choose. And part of why you see podcasts just exploding is that level of choice, right? And the kind of just amazing diversity of content and voices and perspectives that are out there right now, much of which you just can't get on traditional broadcast airwaves. So I think that's a big part of it. And you're also seeing, organizations, sponsors catching on to just how much value there is in this industry. So here's a stat that we like to talk about recently at NPR, which is compared to 3 years ago, NPR's revenue from podcasts is now 10 times what it was. 10 times in 3 years.
Wow.
And that's not just because we're delivering 10 times as many shows, right? That's a lot of our stalwart programs like TED Radio Hour and right, all the ones we've been talking about, Fresh Air, as well as new programs like Embedded and Hidden Brain and Invisibilia. So it really all adds up to be pretty profound growth in terms of the number of people listening and the number of sponsors who are interested in taking advantage of it.
Two questions. So one observation is, the other thing is I think the time shifting, that I think that as everyone got DVRs and everybody got conditioned to TV on demand. Because I think if it was plotted that there was kind of an early heyday of podcasts and then it dipped. I remember being made fun of when I was listening to a podcast because they're like, people still listen to podcasts. And that was a few years ago. And now they've kind of exploded and people point to Serial. But I think part of it is also the time shifting nature that I can listen to it literally on demand when I want to listen to it. But when you say the revenue growth, I haven't listened to a pledge drive in probably 3 years because I've shifted. So I'm aware when they're on because the radio comes on in the morning. But for the most part, I'm kicking over to a podcast. So is the revenue, because they're not called advertisers, they're called underwriters or whatever, the NPR, is it because you've got those, Hidden Brain is supported by, or is it listeners when there are occasional, I'm trying to think whether NPR or whether it's more just PRX that kind of occasionally says, go here. Like I remember trying to go and donate to Planet Money, and it was hard. Like I wanted to go give money to support Planet Money, and I don't know if I wound up giving to WNYC or whatever it was. So where does that revenue, when you say the revenue growth, I guess I'm asking what's the model that happens under?
Yeah. Really, when I'm talking about that, it's classic underwriting and sponsorship. So the Hidden Brain is brought to you by. That's really where the direct revenue comes. In addition to that, obviously NPR gets a lot of funding from the member stations themselves, paying for programming. So, indirectly, you could say that there's some revenue coming from that direction as well, and institutional giving and that kind of thing. But what I'm talking about really is just looking at underwriting and sponsorship itself. It's growing tremendously, and I know a lot of podcasts are finding that to be the case. And you guys clearly need to get on it.
No.
The underwriting train.
We've seen our revenue growth also triple in the last year and a half.
It's actually increased infinitely because
yeah, that's right.
When you 0 times
congratulations,
anything.
That's awesome.
Yeah, it's through the roof.
But do you have, because you've got the specific nature of the programs, is part of that, are you providing evidence to the underwriters to say, wow, if people are interested in neuroscience and psychology, these are people that you want to target, so we can kind of guarantee, and we can also give you some sort of data about the scale of how many people are listening to Hidden Brain?
Yeah, so the advantages that we have are in a lot of ways similar to the advantages on the air as well with sponsors. So, we have a lot of evidence, decades going back now, about how listener perception of people who advertise on public radio, who sponsor public radio, the perception of those brands or likelihood to consider those brands is significantly higher than on commercial radio.
And the downside is they're all hippie liberals who are just getting brainwashed by the left-wing media, but...
I don't know which podcast you're listening to, but...
Okay, so I think I cut you off, but you were saying that you've got credibility as a desirable target. I feel like even for for-profit podcasts, I feel like with my clients, there's kind of a miss that it is kind of pretty easy, and my perception is relatively cheap to become an advertiser on a podcast, and you have a pretty good sense of the audience. But is there also a defining the audience? So you're an audience guy, and other podcasts, and I could have sworn I heard this on an NPR one, and I went back and tried to find it, and I Googled for it and couldn't find it. Like the old fill out a listener survey, tell us about yourself. Are you involved with those?
Yeah, so that's part of what we do for the various shows, the various podcasts, is constantly doing customer research or listener audience surveys, really, to understand how people are reacting to the shows, to understand, of course, their demographics. We test things like how much do people remember the sponsors they're hearing in the podcasts as well, right? So we can go back to the sponsor and say, like, hey, this is how many people unaided were remembering your particular underwriting spot. And the kind of reach that you're getting. So we gather that kind of data through surveys for sponsorship purposes, for content purposes, right, to understand what's working, for just overall strategy purposes. So we know, where are we connecting with our audience in a very real way. So, we'll do cross-show surveys where we get a bunch of, we're doing one of those right now that's out in the market. And we'll do like deep dives. We did a survey on, just Invisibilia's audience, for example, just recently, when that team really wants to immerse themselves in how the listeners are feeling about the shows that they just finished listening to.
And can people tell the two original hosts apart audibly?
So some people claim to, but we think that's a myth.
This actually just sparked, God, you're going to kill me, Helbling. So I'm now remembering, I'd forgotten the episode that Planet Money did where they talked about Dan Soroyker. I don't think they mentioned Optimizely, but they talked about A/B testing and A/B testing through the NPR One app and actually pushing different can't remember if it was different bumpers or different titles. I can't remember what it was. So are you guys also A/B, because of you have the NPR One app, are you regularly A/B testing? Are you involved in that? Is that another element of it?
Yeah, it is. So let me lay out like the two fundamentally different types of podcast measurement we're doing right now. So, for most of the NPR podcast listening that's happening out there in the wide world, it's happening via players, all manner of audio players that we don't control, right? That are way outside of the NPR influence and so forth. It's only a fairly small percentage of listening that's happening within environments like NPR One, the app, or the NPR.org website, or what have you, right? So where we control the platform, of course, we can control and do a lot more measurement and do a lot more with data and testing, as you said. So yes, for example, when the NPR Politics podcast was getting started late last fall, one of the first things they did was they put a couple of sample episodes on NPR One as a test bed before anybody else heard it, as a way to start gauging interest. Did people stick through it? Did they skip? You can learn a lot by just looking at a sample audience, right, in a platform like that. And unannounced, right? It starts appearing in the flow of NPR One audio and seeing what works. And they learn a tremendous amount about what that show, the promise of that show was, and the level of interest as well. And then we back that up. So, very often our group does the research behind concept testing of shows. So we'll get together either as a focus group or just a bunch of individuals, and we'll have them listen to part of a new show and give us their opinion, right? Existing listeners, potential new listeners. And so we'll use all this data in making decisions about, which shows get brought to fruition, if a focus needs to change or things need to pivot. We can learn a lot early before an official launch. So yeah, NPR One is a great platform for that kind of testing, because we can roll things out. We've got a ready audience, and we can see all the detailed metrics much more than we can get through, the vast majority of NPR podcast listening that's happening out there.
So is there a weekly podcast performance measurement dashboard or something? Like, is there internally, are you guys saying, yeah, that one started off strong, but it's kind of slipped? Is there, I guess, even backing up from that, when it comes to, do you have consistent KPIs for all podcasts, basically, that people are aligned to? And if so, I guess, what are they, and how good or bad do you feel they are?
Yeah. Well, let me lay out the way we really think about it is that there are different ways of measuring podcasts for different purposes right now, and in fact that's a good thing. So let me back up. If you think about the websites that we've grown to love over the years. When you think about the web, we really have at least 3 different measures of the web for different purposes. We have tools like good old Google Analytics, our number of record, our internal number of record with the most comprehensive data, where we can do the deepest kind of analysis, and right? I mean, that's one source. We have another source for doing industry comparisons. We have the ComScores of the world, right, where we can do true apples-to-apples industry-wide comparisons that we can't really get through GA, obviously. And then finally, you think about sponsorship and underwriting and the kind of metrics that they need on the web. And you've got DFP, right? It's not like we're using Google Analytics to provide stats for our sponsors for banner ads and so forth. So this is exactly where the world of podcasts is growing up into right now. So same kind of format. You've got the number of record, our internal number of record. For that, and I'll come back to that in a minute, but for that we are doing raw server log analysis and using Splunk, which wasn't really made for this purpose, but we're using it, and it actually works out really well. Using Splunk to parse raw log files and generate reports and dashboards as we see fit. That's our number of record internally, and our number of record externally as well, for like the number of official, users and downloads for our shows. For industry comparisons, you've got a couple of sources. iTunes was the only one for a while, but honestly, that their top 20 is a bit dicey. The iTunes ranking is, people who have tried to analyze this kind of throw up their hands, because it's not really a top 20. It's more like here's the top movers and shakers as Apple sees them right now, but not necessarily a reliable top list. But Podtrac recently, in the last few months, has come out with their ranking now of the top podcast producers in the country. And it's becoming sort of the de facto, I think, reliable metric of that. And then finally, you've got
what's
advertising
their
and
data?
sponsors.
Where's Podtrac's data coming from? Is that a panel? Is that?
They think of Podtrac as So sort of like FeedBurner used to be. So essentially an organization works with Podtrac and submits, every file request through Podtrac down to the CDN. So Podtrac's seeing all the file requests and can therefore, look at all the raw data almost as well as you could if you're looking at your own raw log files. So that's how they do it. So you have to actually sign on for their service and then redirect through them. But once you do, you're in business, and it's free. And then finally, for advertisers and underwriters, sponsors, similarly, right, we're using ad server numbers for podcasts as well. So with NPR, our podcasts are on Triton Digital Media, hosted there. We use them for our ad server, and they provide the sort of third-party metrics for underwriters in terms of billing purposes. So you've got, just like with web, you've got 3 different ways of measuring, all equally valid, different advantages, and all are really important to our business. So you asked about if we have dashboards. So it's those internal numbers I talked about, where we're actually parsing raw log files, using this tool called Splunk to generate reports and dashboards. That's really the intelligence that internally we're looking at day in and day out, week in, week out.
But it does seem like there's, in the for-profit world, where you've got the Panoply Network, which is, I think, kind of a media-driven, but more for-profit media-driven. There's Gimlet Media, which essentially spun out from NPR because most of the founders, came from NPR. I feel like you've got probably more clarity of thought around some of this measurement stuff than maybe some of them do. I mean, because it seems like the for-profit world, they're almost exclusively playing to the advertisers, whereas it seems like with the public media focus, you might have a little heavier stake in the audience, maybe, and content quality. I don't know. I'm extrapolating or riffing.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I can tell you that obviously serving our audience, creating amazing content is way up there in the priority list. But obviously, it doesn't happen without sponsorship, right? So you got to have all of this. It's at least a 3-legged stool going on there, and so the focus is just really high on all of the above.
So you were talking about Podtrac, which is interesting because that's sort of giving you that external view that's sort of being provided in terms of competitive intelligence. But you've also done quite a bit of work inside of NPR to do standardization. And that work, can you talk about that and how does that track with or align with what you're seeing happening with tools like Podtrac? And so are there conflicts emerging? Is there good unity in terms of that? Is it because there's just so little other data that everybody has to basically follow the same path?
Yeah, I'll sometimes talk about this as podcast measurement being kind of still the Wild West, insofar as there's been for a decade now a lot of really smart sheriffs all around the country doing great work independently on measurement and getting a lot better at it. But what we haven't had is a true law of the land. We haven't had a true industry-wide standard like we were talking about earlier, where everyone can point to that thing and say, yep, that's the standard. That's the yardstick we're going to use when we talk about defining what a download is, what a user is when we talk about podcasts. It turns out there's a lot of little things in the world of podcasts that can really result in vastly different numbers. So questions for you guys. So here's a scenario. So imagine that you've got one person, and you know they're one person because they have an IP address and a user agent combination, right? Because you don't have cookies in the world of podcasts. All you have is IP and user agent. So you've got an IP and user agent combo that downloads one of your episodes 3 times, the same episode 3 times in a single day. Should that count as 1 download or 3? And who decides? So here's another scenario. Let's say that person downloads a third of this particular episode we're making right now. This is very meta. But if they download a third of this episode and they whether you don't know if they play it or not, all you know is I downloaded it. Does that count as a download? Like, would you count that in your metrics? Like, all these decisions come to the fore really quickly, which is why we needed a yardstick. So what we did was last year, NPR got together with about a dozen other public radio organizations. So some of them were stations, some of them were big public radio producers like PRX and APM and so forth, and all sorts of other alphabet soup. And we got together and we started talking about this problem, realizing that we need to create a yardstick of our own. We need to create a common understanding, guidelines, if you will, about how we as public radio are thinking about this space, are thinking about how we count, what we count, why a standard is important. So we worked on these public radio podcast measurement guidelines, and they came out in February, so earlier this year now. And it's been great. We've been seeing vendors start to use them. It's been influencing larger conversations at the IAB. So the Interactive Advertising Bureau has a working group working on this issue as well, on podcast measurement and technologies. And so
please tell me they're not going to be the ones who wind up as the final say.
well, we're at that table and having the same conversation, right, with a much larger group across the industry than just public radio. You can imagine at that table, but it's really important because we want to make sure that when we're talking not only internally but also with potential sponsors and with the press in terms of coverage that we get, we want to use the same language, all of us, and we want to use as much as we can the same yardstick. So then when we're talking about how many listeners a podcast has or how many downloads an episode has, we can be confident that we're reliably and credibly talking about it in the same way. We can compare apples to apples. So big believer in creating industry consensus around this, ideally, eventually a real standard like we have on broadcast, television, etc. And the web. You could even argue we may not have a standard per se, but at least we've all agreed on yes, there's this thing called a page view, there's this thing called a user, and here's generally how we measure it. And we trust our tools as the de facto standards creation, right, in that regard. We don't have it in podcasts right now, but we really need it.
And just to be clear, that when Steve, you're saying there are standards, because you shared the link beforehand, there's literally a Google Doc standard, which I'm assuming we can just post in our show notes for anyone who's curious as to what those are?
Yeah.
No?
I would describe, feel free to post. It's bit.ly/podcast guidelines. Feel free to post it. And it is just guidelines. I mean, NPR and the world of public radio, we are not a standards body, nor do we want to be one when we grow up. We're not in a place to audit, police, deal with compliance, and create a real standard. So they are merely guidelines, but we hope useful ones.
All right, I just want to...
There's a W3C joke in there somewhere.
Yeah, right. I think this standards conversation is one that's very applicable across any analytics pursuit. So that's really fascinating. And certainly the overarching governance from an industry perspective is one, right, that to your point, NPR is not looking to take that on, but just for yourselves to have that is such a great step. It's pretty cool. And so I read through it and it was just fascinating because it started off pretty normal. And then all of a sudden it was like, in 206 return codes are like this. And I was like, and we're back, because it got real technical.
Yeah,
actually.
200 or 206 plus byte range 0 minus or 0.
And I was like, all right, so this has got some very specific things to it. And I think that's what you were kind of alluding to maybe before, around sort of, hey, for all these 10 years, people were doing a great job, just doing it a different way, and not a lot of consistency on a user or show by show basis for measurement. So creating a standard like that is really good. So Tim, we're going to have to go back. Let's say now, let's subscribe to the Public Radio Podcast Measurement Guidelines, and let's try to refactor our numbers. We don't really talk about our numbers, so we won't, but
Well, but I guess there's a question in that, because we use a third-party host, which it sounded like you said, where do the hosts, kind of the cloud-based hosts, fit in this? They're not on the list, which I think is fantastic that they're not contributing to what the definitions are. But it sounds like you were saying that potentially providers saying we're running the stats. It's funny looking at different platforms hosting, and they're like, oh, if you upgrade, you'll get more advanced analytics. And I'm like, I know what's basically in the log file. Like you can't give me much more. But there is a part of me that thinks, when do they start saying we are following the public radio guidelines, whether that is our default is we follow those guidelines, or whether it's an option for you to view, what does it really look like? If you're feeling good about yourself, slide this switch the other way and you'll realize that you and your extended family are half of your audience.
But no, that's exactly right. And that's starting to happen. It's been really exciting to see that start to happen, both on the side of vendors and hosting companies, as well as measurement companies starting to take on this issue. A lot of them have seat to the table at this IAB group that I mentioned. So the conversation is happening. It's really fruitful. And I think everyone recognizes that, we can't just be out there measuring based on whatever yardstick we want. We got to be talking about it in the same way if we want this industry to evolve to its full potential.
And Splunk that's a pretty serious tool. I've never worked with it, but familiar with it. Like you got your log files, you're cranking them through Splunk, you're doing some real stuff there. As you guys were talking through some of this, what's the cutoff? Were there contributors to this document who were like, never really thought about it, we just counted every request? Are there some that they're like, their brains are hurting and they're realizing that they've been really, really simplistic? Or is it kind of by definition the ones who are involved are ones that have, can kind of get their hands dirty with a log file?
Yeah, it's a mix. So, you've got some of the larger organizations that have their own capability for this, rolling their own numbers using tools like Splunk or Elasticsearch or what have you, based on log files. And then you've got, a lot of orgs, part of that group as well, smaller stations, for example, who are much more reliant on third parties, whether it's PodTrack, right, or whether it's their own hosting provider, to give them the metrics. But now they can go back to these, hosting providers, for example, and make sure that they're getting the kinds of metrics that they want. So they can ask, hey, how are you guys calculating downloads right now? And are you doing this X, Y, and Z? And making sure you're getting audience metrics, talking about measuring users and not just measuring downloads. How are you filtering out bots? How are you filtering out downloads that we kind of know aren't real listening? How are you dealing with, the same user downloading the same file 3 times in a particular day? So you can be much more intelligent, right? And we're all trying to up our game in this department of just being more intelligent about the metrics that we do get, whether we're generating them ourselves or whether we're getting them from any kind of third party. And that's true across everything, right? Not just the world of podcasts, which obviously I care way too much about.
You can't care too much about that.
No, because it takes me back to early in your career when you would do something to say, hey, technically our data quality is really poor because we're tracking, like to your point, like all these bots. So let's start filtering them out. And people would be like, well, wait a second. That'll make our numbers go down.
Right.
And so it's just interesting. It's sort of like, all right, so yeah, I get that. These baby steps. So maybe the real big closer of a question is, are we smarter this time around with podcast analytics than we were with digital analytics 15 years ago?
Or will we go up that curve faster, right? Well, will we at least go through that maturation process more quickly?
Yeah. It does seem like it does happen faster and faster, right? Going way back, thinking about radio and TV measurement, it took decades to really get better and better at that. And we're never going to hit perfect. Like the asymptote never approaches my geometry just got lost in my brain. But we're never going to.
We're tracking with you.
That's right. We're never going to get perfect, but we're going to get close. And I think we're getting faster at getting better. And it started with the web. And it's carrying forth to app measurement and podcast measurement and, you name it.
I wonder whether light bulbs, right now, I feel like podcast advertising is likely comparatively incredibly cheap. That even without great measurement, with all of the gaps, I still feel like just because the weird mix of people who are of organizations that are advertising and the lack of kind of really big mainstream advertisers where they could just own 7 podcasts for a year for the cost of what they spent in, 2 days on banner ads or 30 seconds on TV. I kind of wonder if podcast adoption keeps going up and all this, and there will be more and more brands kind of clicking too, that we may run into kind of a messier world where it still seems like there's the cost to make podcasts. Like you can get a high margin. We're not making a business out of this, and you guys are public media, so maybe the 3 of us are the worst to talk about it. But it seems like from a business model, it's going to get better for the podcast. It's going to get more competitive. Right now, I feel like brands are missing an opportunity. If they're if they have a key audience that is a demographic that is likely to be enabled to listen to podcasts, and they could spend a little bit of time figuring out where those podcasts are, and get some decent conservative or aggressive, some range of what the reach is, and it's a captive audience. And to your point, there are some podcasts where they probably have credibility, not necessarily NPR ones, but other ones saying these guys are putting out great content and I've got a better boost than if I'm just running on CBS. There's potential there. That's tangent number 72.
Well, yeah. And I mean, the potential is, it has yet to really reach its max, I'm sure, right? So you look at Edison research data now saying that 57 million Americans are listening to podcasts monthly. 57 million. That's like 21% of the population of adults, or 12 plus adults. So that's still, you can look at it either way, right? You can look at that as, wow, that's gotten a lot bigger than it used to be 10 years before that. But you could also look at it as that's got a long ways to go to get huge, truly huge, in a way that the really large companies are going to think about it as a primary channel for sponsorship and not just kind of like a minor secondary thing that they do.
Yeah, I remember when paid search was kicking on with that, where it was kind of like this little one person's little part-time job for a pretty large company. They're just throwing some money at AdWords. So yeah, those were the days.
Well, this has been really awesome, but unfortunately we are going to have to start to wrap up. I think this conversation will be interesting to more than just the three of us.
I hope so.
And so
I'm pretty sure we know our audience has a propensity to be podcast listeners. This is not the crack that's keeping them listening to podcasts.
We're talking to our own type of people for sure with this show. But yeah, as you've been listening, if you do have thoughts or questions or things like that, please definitely reach out on our Facebook page or the Measure Slack. Well, one of the things we love to do, or we like to do at the tail end of the show, is our last call. You know, we go around the horn and talk about something that we find interesting or useful in our job, career, or life. And so, Steve, why don't we kick it off with you?
Yeah, sure. So I came across this article last week in Media Shift. The title of it is kind of fun. I like to say it. The title of it is Bulgarian Analytics Startup Aims to Fix How Publishers Use Data. And I just like seeing the phrase. So if you go search Media Shift for Bulgarian Analytics Startup, you'll find it. And it wasn't so much.
I feel like the content has to be a letdown. Like
I know.
Can it possibly deliver on that?
Well, I would say, there are a ton of articles and perspectives across the years about how publishers, media companies use analytics, right? There's a lot of ways to do that. There's ways, how do you integrate analytics into your newsroom and your content folks, really embedded in the numbers. This article's, kind of interesting. But what really stood out for me is it jump-started yet another conversation of many that we have at NPR around how do we expose folks in our newsroom and our programming groups to all the numbers we have in a way that's simple and understandable, right? So they talked about this company who does something they call a CPI, content performance indicator, where for every particular story, they'll do basically an index, a calculated score around that story's performance. So it's a combination of page views and shares and likes, and so they do a calculated average, a calculated score that they've made up. And we have this conversation all the time within NPR as well about, there's a certain benefit to creating a nice simple index score for evaluating content, but at the same time it hides all the really interesting complexity about how individual pieces can be better or worse in certain ways. So is that better? Is that worse? So this article, it's not a crazy detailed article, and I don't think has pushed things in a lot of new directions, but jump-started a conversation within our group that's been really healthy over the last couple of days.
All right. So yeah, I've got a last call. I just recently started reading a new book called Smart Choices. It's a practical guide to making better decisions, and I'm really enjoying it. It's written by John Hammond and Ralph Keeney and another guy who I'm totally blanking on his name. But it's, what we do in analytics is help people make better decisions. So I'm trying to learn how to do that. So there you go. Book recommendation.
Okay. I will continue the downward slide of the quality of the last calls. I believe I made a podcast recommendation on the last one. There's no flipping way that we could actually talk to NPR and not have me just totally log roll for NPR. I'm going to do a dual one, and I'm breaking, I'm sure, some internal style thing, and that both of these have been mentioned while we've been talking. But because it came back to me, the Planet Money episode on A or B, not super deep from a A/B testing. It's back in December, episode 669. But if you are in the optimization space and you're kind of sometime trying to talk to a relative or a friend who says, what do you do? That's not a bad way to say, hey, listeners to NPR think that whatever being talked about has credibility, as Steve told us. Point them to that episode. And then I am going to also last call the NPR Politics podcast, because if you enjoy this podcast, if you're at all a political junkie, and that is another one of my many, many vices, the politics slate. The slate. Oh, that was bad. That was bad. The Slate Political Gabfest has been around longer than the NPR Politics podcast, but the Slate Political, without saying it, they pretty much said that the NPR Politics podcast overtook them somewhere by some measure at some point. I think the quality of having smart journalists talking, everyone from Tamara Keith, who apparently everyone adores, to Ron Elving, who is just like the old man of the sea, the wise, to Sam Sanders. So I kind of think the format's great, because I think there are 5 to 7 different people, and they just kind of rotate through, and it's in theory kind of a weekly roundup, but they've been doing, they got to do 3 or 4 a week. And it's a little mind boggling being on the inside of this podcast and knowing how long it takes us to get from recording to standing it up to they're turning stuff around inside 10 hours. So I'm kind of doing a dual last call, and they're all podcast NPR related.
Preach. Well said.
That's right. Well, this is outstanding. And Steve Mulder, thank you so much for coming on the show. It's been a pleasure.
Great to be here. Thanks.
Awesome. Well, as you've been hearing, podcasts can be interesting to measure. So don't hesitate to reach out on Slack or Facebook, talk about it some more. If you're not on the Measure Slack, then you probably ought to be. And since we're talking about podcasts and you want to jump over to iTunes and rate the show, thanks for that. We would appreciate that. And, give a couple listens to some NPR podcasts. I think Steve will know exactly where that bump in traffic is coming from.
That's right.
That's right. So, for Tim Wilson, my co-host, this is Michael Helbling, and everybody keep analyzing.
Thanks for listening, and don't forget to join the conversation on Facebook, Twitter, or Measure Slack group. We welcome your comments and questions. Facebook.com/Analytics Hour or at Analytics Hour on Twitter.
So smart guys wanted to fit in, so they made up a term called analytics. Analytics don't work.
I'm either Anonymous Lemur or Anonymous Wolverine. I'd like to think of myself as Anonymous Wolverine. I gotta be.
No, that's good. I respect that. I like podcasts. I hear they're going places.
Yeah, podcasts are something that, we should all keep an eye on.
If only there was better content.
Yeah.
Their second season kind of blew.
Well, so did True Detective, so hey, nobody bats 1,000.
Yeah, but The Wrath of Khan was the best Star Trek movie, and that was number 2.
Oh, good point. And Empire Strikes Back.
I'm just saying, number 2s can be good.
Need to get your brother to come back down to Columbus. I haven't seen him in 3-4 years.
Yeah, he spent a little time in Africa recently. I don't even know if he's back yet.
Yeah, that's good. You have a similar relationship to him that I seem to have with my sister.
Well, we talk sometimes.
I just watch for Facebook posts.
Yeah, exactly. That's right.
So that was right after Excite and Alta Vista. Oh, I could go, down search engine history here.
Also, my dog is deciding right now is the time to bark. That's not good.
This does not happen in NPR's DC studios.
Exactly.
Although there was a family day, right? Bring your daughter to work day or something. And somebody went into the studio and hit a wrong button. A kid did, and all sorts of mischief happened. And so, it happens everywhere.
Whose kid was it?
Actually, I never heard whose kid. Maybe they were trying to keep it a secret. There was too much embarrassment. I don't know. But the engineers fixed it like that.
It was really Bob Edwards snuck in and he did it.
Yeah, exactly.
Bitter. I'm a borderline unhealthy NPR fanboy, so
that sentence makes no sense to me.
Nice. So I'm looking here at PodTrack as we're speaking, and Tim, we have a little bit of work to do to crack the top 10. We call ourselves the #1 explicit analytics podcast. That's what we are.
Explicit digital analytics.
Yeah, digital analytics.
I think all you really need is This American Life to play an example episode, right? One weekend, and then you'll be golden.
Well, I mean, if you're doing all this testing on the NPR One app, I mean, we should probably just sort of chuck one of our episodes in there and just see how it does. You know, maybe it'll be the next breakout hit. I'm sure that being a podcaster is just wine and roses.
Rock, flag, and podcast measurement.